There is a silent pattern that traps most people. And the most dangerous part is that almost no one realizes they are inside it. Wake up, rush, work, get distracted, sleep, and repeat again and again and again without questioning. It feels normal because everyone is doing the same. But there is a difference between living and merely repeating. Andrew Carnegie, one of the richest men in history, had a very clear view about this. He believed that most people don't fail because of lack of effort, but because of lack of conscious direction. Working hard does not mean moving forward. It simply means being busy. And being busy is not the same as being free. The cycle begins subtly. From an early age, there is pressure to follow a path, study, work, be responsible, seek security. And without realizing it, life starts following a script that was not written by you. Time is exchanged for money, but there is rarely a real reflection about where this choice is leading. And here is the most dangerous part: the cycle doesn't hurt enough to be questioned. It only numbs. It's not extreme suffering. It's a mild, constant discomfort that becomes part of everyday life. There is a feeling that things could be different, that there is more, but nothing changes. This happens because change requires awareness. Awareness that maybe the problem is not in the world, but in the pattern repeated every day. Andrew Carnegie understood that wealth does not begin with money. It begins with a way of thinking, with the ability to step out of autopilot. While someone is only reacting, they are not creating. While only following, they are not choosing. And those who do not choose accept any outcome. The cycle is sustained by three factors: lack of clarity, lack of courage, and excess distraction. Clarity to see where you truly are. Courage to admit that maybe this is not enough. And silence to face what is usually avoided. Because it is in silence that the right questions arise. And the right questions break cycles. But that is uncomfortable. When the noise stops, there is no more distraction. What appears is an encounter with yourself. And often comes the realization that too much time has been spent on autopilot. The good news is that cycles are not prisons. They are patterns. And patterns can be broken. Not with motivation, but with decision. The decision to stop. The decision to observe. The decision to choose differently, even if it feels uncomfortable. Because staying the same also has a cost. And that cost is usually realized too late. The question is not whether a cycle exists. The question is whether there is willingness to leave it, or if the choice will be to continue. Because the moment awareness exists, the cycle begins to lose strength. And for the first time, repetition stops, and life begins. And when that happens, something changes. Not necessarily on the outside, but within. Circumstances remain the same. Demands remain. Responsibilities remain. But the way of seeing changes completely. Patterns begin to be identified. Choices begin to be noticed. What once felt like obligation starts to reveal alternatives. And this brings discomfort. Because seeing creates responsibility. While there is no awareness, there is a comfortable narrative. This is just how it is. There is no other way. Everyone lives like this. But once awareness appears, that narrative loses its power. And this is where most people get stuck. Because noticing the cycle is only the beginning. Breaking it requires action. Andrew Carnegie said that a mind expanded by a new idea never returns to its original size. And this creates a different kind of discomfort. Not from lack, but from inconsistency. There is knowledge, but no action. There is clarity, but no movement. And this creates a silent erosion. For this reason, many people avoid seeing. Because seeing demands change, and change demands rupture. Rupture of habits, environments, and mental patterns. And most importantly, rupture of identity. Because the cycle is not only in what is done, it is in how identity itself is constructed. Phrases like, "I am like this is not for me, I can't," are not facts. They are conditioning. And as long as this conditioning remains, the cycle continues. But there is a turning point. And this point is not grand. It is not a remarkable event. It is not a moment of extreme motivation. It is a silent decision. A decision that no one sees, but that changes everything. The decision not to repeat. This decision can begin small, almost imperceptible. A change in habit. Different question. A more conscious choice. It seems simple, but this is exactly how cycles are broken. Not through big moves, but through small, consistent decisions. And this is where most people fail. There is an expectation of radical change, but no consistency in small actions. Andrew Carnegie built his trajectory based on directed consistency. Not doing a lot randomly, but doing what matters repeatedly with intention. Because without intention, even effort loses value. And there is another important point. Leaving the cycle is lonely. Internal changes are not always followed by those around you. Some people won't understand. Others will resist. Some will try to pull you back to the previous pattern. Not out of malice, but because your change creates discomfort in those who remain the same. That is why many give up. Not because they are incapable, but because they struggle with this initial isolation. But there is something on the other side. Clarity. A clarity that does not depend on approval, comparison, or external validation. Decisions begin to be made based on meaning, not expectation. And at that point, true freedom emerges. Not only financial freedom, but mental freedom. The freedom to choose to say no, to act with awareness. And that changes everything. Because when the mind changes, behavior changes. And when behavior changes, results change. But everything begins with awareness. And maybe now that awareness is starting. Maybe some ideas are making sense. Maybe there is a certain discomfort in recognizing patterns. That is a good sign. It means there is distance from autopilot. But noticing is not the end of the process. It is the beginning of responsibility. From this moment on, it is no longer possible to ignore. There is another point that is almost never discussed when talking about change. The brain prefers what is familiar, even when the familiar is not good. This means the cycle is not sustained only by lack of willpower, but by an internal protection mechanism. What is known feels safe. What is predictable feels comfortable. And any attempt to break out of that pattern is interpreted as risk. That is why, even when there is awareness that something needs to change, there is often a force pulling back. This force is not weakness. It is conditioning. For years, behaviors have been repeated until they became automatic. Thoughts were accepted without questioning. Decisions were made based on expectations, not on what truly made sense. And all of this built a solid pattern. Breaking this pattern is not just a rational choice. It is a process that requires conscious repetition until a new pattern is formed. And here is an important detail. At the beginning, the new pattern always feels wrong. It feels uncomfortable. It feels out of place. Because there is no familiarity yet. And many people give up exactly at this point. They interpret discomfort as a sign of error, when in reality, it is a sign of change. Andrew Carnegie deeply understood the power of habits and repetition. He believed that constant thoughts turn into actions, and repeated actions build results. In other words, the cycle does not begin in behavior. It begins in the mind. If the thinking does not change, behavior will not change. And if behavior does not change, results remain the same. That is why trying to change only external actions without altering the internal pattern rarely works. There is a need for reprogramming. And this reprogramming begins with something simple, yet powerful: questioning. Question routines. Question decisions. Question beliefs. Question what has always been accepted as truth. Because many of the truths that sustain the cycle were never examined. They were simply inherited. And what is inherited is not always chosen. Another critical point is the environment. The environment reinforces patterns. If everything around remains the same, there is a natural tendency to remain the same. Conversations, habits, references, everything influences. And without noticing, the environment becomes a constant reinforcement of the cycle. That is why real change almost always involves adjustments in the environment. Not necessarily radical changes, but strategic ones. The type of content consumed, the people around you, the daily stimuli, all of this shapes behavior. Andrew Carnegie was known for deeply valuing the intellectual environment and the influences around him. He surrounded himself with people, ideas, and references that expanded his vision. Because he understood that individual growth rarely happens in complete isolation. There is a constant interaction between mind and environment, and aligning both accelerates the process. Another silent factor that maintains the cycle is comparison. Comparing paths, results, and timing creates distortions. It generates anxiety. It creates a sense of being behind, and often leads to paralysis. Because instead of focusing on the internal process, attention shifts outward. But cycles are not broken by looking outward. They are broken by adjusting what is internal. And that requires focus. Focus on what can be controlled. Focus on personal decisions. Focus on consistency. Because consistency is what transforms intention into reality. Without consistency, any attempt at change dissolves over time. And here comes a decisive point: discipline. Not rigid discipline based on pressure, but conscious discipline based on purpose. Doing what needs to be done, even when there is no desire. Because waiting for motivation is staying trapped in the cycle. The cycle is comfortable precisely because it does not require conscious effort. It runs on autopilot. Breaking it requires presence. It requires attention. It requires choice. And choice, repeated over time, builds identity. A new identity, not based on the past, but based on present decisions. Andrew Carnegie built his trajectory understanding that identity is not fixed. It is shaped by daily actions. And this completely changes the perception of personal capability. It is not about being something. It is about becoming through what is done repeatedly. Another important point is understanding that there is no perfect moment for change. Waiting for the ideal scenario is just a more sophisticated form of delay. The cycle feeds on that delay. There is always a reason to wait a little longer. One more day, one more week, one more condition, and time passes without real change. Breaking this requires starting before feeling ready, because readiness comes after action, not before. And each small action reinforces the new pattern. Over time, what once felt uncomfortable becomes natural. What once felt difficult becomes simple. And what once seemed impossible becomes part of routine. This is the point where the cycle begins to reverse. Before, autopilot led to the same place. Now, autopilot begins to lead to a new direction. But this only happens with enough consistency. Without consistency, the old pattern always regains control. Because it is stronger, more established, more familiar. That is why patience is essential. Real change is not immediate. It is built. And this construction is invisible at first, but inevitable over time. Another important aspect is accepting that not every day will be productive. Not every day will be motivated. Not every day will be perfect. And that is fine. The mistake is abandoning the process because of a bad day. Because the old cycle feeds exactly on these interruptions. Restarting quickly is more important than never failing. Consistency is not perfection. It is continuity. And continuity builds results. Gradually, solidly, without shortcuts. Andrew Carnegie did not build his trajectory in isolated moments of intensity. It was repetition over time that consolidated everything. And this applies to any kind of change: financial, mental, professional, or personal. In the end, everything comes back to the same point: awareness, decision, action. There is an even deeper layer that sustains this cycle, and it is almost never noticed: the need for validation. Many decisions are not made based on what makes sense internally, but on what will be accepted externally. Choices are shaped by approval. Paths are followed to avoid judgment. And behaviors are adjusted to maintain belonging. This creates a silent pattern where life stops being self-directed and becomes reactive. Life is no longer lived to build something authentic. It is lived to maintain an image. And that image requires constant maintenance. It demands effort. It demands adaptation. It demands concessions. Over time, this external construction becomes so strong that the internal reference disappears. It becomes difficult to know what is truly desired. It becomes difficult to distinguish desire from expectation. And this sustains the cycle. Because without internal clarity, any direction seems valid. And when any direction works, there is no real progress. There is only movement. Andrew Carnegie understood that one of the greatest human limitations is relying on the opinion of others to define one's path, because that creates instability. Today there is approval. Tomorrow there may not be. And when direction depends on that, consistency is lost. That is why developing internal autonomy is essential. The ability to decide without depending on applause. The ability to continue even without recognition. The ability to sustain personal choices. This does not mean ignoring the world. It means not being controlled by it. Another factor that sustains the cycle is a low tolerance for discomfort. Any sign of difficulty is interpreted as something to avoid. Any prolonged effort is seen as too much. Any greater challenge leads to retreat. But growth does not happen in comfort. Comfort maintains. It does not transform. And the longer one remains there, the harder it becomes to leave. Because the pattern strengthens. The brain adapts. Behavior consolidates. And the cycle intensifies. Breaking this requires increasing tolerance for discomfort. Learning to sustain longer processes. Accepting that progress is not always immediate. And understanding that discomfort is not a sign of error. It is a sign of expansion. Andrew Carnegie built his trajectory by constantly facing challenges. But the difference was not avoiding difficulty. It was developing the ability to move through it with consistency. Another relevant factor is overstimulation. Excess information creates the illusion of progress. Consuming content gives a sense of movement. But without application, nothing changes. There is a modern trap where learning replaces action. And that keeps the cycle active. Because as long as there is consumption, there is the feeling of progress. But without execution, there is no transformation. That is why reducing excess information is just as important as acquiring knowledge. Select, filter, apply, and only then seek more. This simple process prevents overload and increases efficiency. Another rarely discussed point is the relationship with time. There is a distorted sense of urgency for things that do not matter, and constant procrastination for what truly matters. Time is spent on tasks that do not move life forward, while important decisions are postponed. And this creates a cycle of busyness without progress. Andrew Carnegie deeply valued the strategic use of time, not just working more, but working better, directing energy toward what truly generates results, eliminating what does not add value, and protecting focus. Because focus is a limited resource, and without focus, any effort becomes diluted. Another essential aspect is responsibility. As long as there is a tendency to assign causes externally, the cycle continues. Blaming the environment, circumstances, people, or luck prevents progress, because it removes control. And without control, there is no change. Taking responsibility does not mean ignoring real difficulties. It means recognizing that, regardless of them, there is still choice. And that choice is the point of power. Andrew Carnegie believed that taking control of personal decisions is the first step toward any real growth. Because from that point, there is direction. There is action. There is construction. Another critical point is emotional consistency. Many decisions are based on momentary states. High motivation leads to action. Low motivation leads to paralysis. And this creates instability. The cycle continues because there is no consistency. Developing emotional stability allows action regardless of mood. Doing what needs to be done, even without desire. This reduces dependence on motivation and increases predictability of results, because action stops being optional and becomes standard. Andrew Carnegie did not rely on motivation to act. He relied on discipline. And discipline is built with repetition, with intention, with clarity. Another factor that sustains the cycle is the lack of metrics. Without measuring, there is no clear progress. Without clear progress, there is no sustainable motivation. And without sustainable motivation, the cycle returns. Defining simple tracking parameters changes this. Track habits. Track results. Track progress. This creates clarity, and clarity strengthens continuity because it makes visible what was previously abstract. And when something becomes visible, it becomes controllable. Another important point is strategic patience. There is an unrealistic expectation for fast results. And when that does not happen, frustration appears. That frustration leads to quitting, and quitting reinforces the cycle. But real processes take time, and understanding this prevents unnecessary interruptions. Andrew Carnegie built wealth over time, not through impulsive moves, but through consistent decisions. Repeated, adjusted, sustained. This pattern is replicable in any area, but it requires maturity. Maturity to continue without immediate results. Maturity to adjust without abandoning. Maturity to persist intelligently. In the end, everything converges to a central point. Awareness sustained by action. It is not a moment. It is a continuous process. It is not a single decision. It is a sequence of decisions. It is not intensity. It is consistency. And this completely transforms the way life is lived because it removes life from autopilot and brings it under control. Not absolute control, but enough control to direct it. And direction changes everything because direction defines destination. And destination is not random. It is built.